Hi there, this is the third module and the introduction video for Module 3 that deals with rationals. And to start things off, I want to tell you a little bit about what it means for an expression or an equation to be rational. So the word rational comes from the root word ratio. And if you remember, ratios are a lot of times represented by fractions. And these fractions compare two values, like 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Trident. 4 out of 5 is often represented as a ratio. So the word rational reminds us of the word ratio, which tells us that we're going to be dealing with fractions. But these fractions aren't just normal fractions. These fractions will have, or might have, a polynomial. We talked about that in Module 2. And the polynomials that we're familiar with are especially those linear polynomials and quadratic polynomials. So you might have a polynomial up in the numerator or the top of the fraction, and you might have a polynomial at the bottom of the fraction. So these fractions will be, I guess, more fancy than just regular fractions like 4/5. So if you're dealing with a rational expression, you'll be dealing with expressions that contain fractions, or a rational equation is an equation that deals with fractions. So take a look at this expression. This expression is 4/6, but this is not a rational expression. This is a good old-fashioned fraction. But you guys know that 4/6 isn't simplified, and it's not simplified because if we factor 4 into 2 times 2 and write 6 as its factors, 2 times 3, then the nice thing is you can cancel common factors in expressions that are common to the numerator and the denominator. So we now know that 4/6 is the same thing as 2/3 because we canceled common factors. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because when you get to more complicated expressions, you're going to have to create factors using the fancy techniques that you learned in Module 2. Remember things like the GCF and quadratic trinomials and difference of squares. These are the techniques that you're going to be learning and, I guess, using to help you simplify expressions, multiply expressions, divide expressions, add, subtract these rational expressions. Now, when you deal with rational expressions, you need to keep in mind that what you do with multiplication and division is going to be fundamentally different than what you do with addition and subtraction. When you deal with multiplication and division, essentially what you're going to be doing is just focusing in on factoring every numerator and every denominator. So factor all numerators, and denominators, and then from there you can cancel common factors, and then you can cancel. Okay? But with addition and subtraction, if you remember how you add and subtract fractions, is you have to focus on common denominators. That's when you need the same denominator. So common denominators is what you need to focus in when you add and subtract. And then once you get common denominators, then you can simplify from there. Okay, so the purpose of this slide is just to remind you that how we multiply and divide is going to be fundamentally different than how we add and subtract. So keep that in mind when you go through this module. Okay, and then comes equations. So you have to know how to deal with expressions. Remember, expressions before you can deal with equations. And with things that are rational, there will be two types of equations. You might see a fraction equal to a fraction, that's called a proportion. A proportion is when you have a fraction equal to a fraction, fraction equal to a fraction, and how you solve proportions is by cross multiplying. Cross multiply, and then you can set those cross products equal, and then that will give you something that you can deal with. So this might give you something that's quadratic. After you cross multiply, you might come across the quadratic, and then if you have a quadratic, then you can factor it and make linear factors. Or maybe you might get lucky and cross multiply and this goes straight to something that's linear, but you're always getting the rational equation down to something that's quadratic or linear, so that you can use the techniques that you learned in modules 1 and 2 to solve. So that's how we deal with proportions. The second type will have an equation with addition or subtraction. With addition or subtraction. And in this case, if you have an equation with addition and subtraction, I think you remember if something's adding or subtracting, you're going to need to focus in on the common denominator, the LCD, the lowest common denominator. But here we're going to take the lowest common denominator and multiply both sides. And then that's going to clear out the fractions and create a quadratic, which will ultimately lead to a linear equation. Hopefully you remember how to do those from the first 2 modules. So you're going to have 2 types of equations, a fraction equal to a fraction, that's a proportion, or an equation with terms, like maybe you might have a fraction plus a fraction equal to a fraction. That's what would be going on here. There you need to find common denominators, and then take that common denominator and multiply through to give you a different kind of equation, either quadratic or linear equation. Okay, well, I hope this introduction video will at least prepare you to the kinds of lessons that you're going to see with Module 3, and hope you have fun with this module.